Welcome to our second video on net zero for financial services and investors. As we finished off our previous video talking about financial service investors have a major role to play, not only in their own transition to net zero, but also in supporting and accelerating the transition of the entire global economy to net zero. This can be done in multiple ways, whether that's reallocating capital, whether that's influencing global policy, whether that's through directly engaging with your clients and customers to educate them and support them on their own transition journeys. This will include risks and opportunities, both for our industry, but also for the global economy as a whole. So I'd like to put this back to the panel as we move into thinking about financial services influencing the global transition. And start off talk about risk. Actually, I'd love to get thoughts on transition risk and how understanding transition risk can shape our response, both to mitigate that risk, but also to create opportunities and accelerate transition.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on that, Colin. Taking a step back, I think it's important to remember as the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, originally conceptualized, climate change and our societal response to it is going to create these two main types of risk and opportunity. If we take the swift policy action to aggressively pursue net zero and the associated kind of lower carbon technologies continue to become cheaper, more highly adopted, there's going to be this transition risk and opportunity that certain assets, certain companies are going to face a loss in revenues and profitability, even to the point of becoming a stranded asset during this transition. On the flip side, this of course creates immense opportunity for investors to take part in the transition. On the order of $4 trillion a year of capital investments going to be needed to fund the energy transition by 2030, according to the IEA. Now, some of this investment is obviously going to be provided by public finance, but we think that private finance has a huge role to play, both through capital markets and in kind of private infrastructure, alternative assets, and so on. Further, while it's not our focus today, I think it's important to at least start with the understanding that the speed and kind of orderliness under which the transition unfolds is going to be directly correlated to the amount of physical climate impact and thus physical risk that investors are going to see in their portfolios. Even under an aggressive and rapid transition, we know that physical risk is going to continue to grow as the world continues to emit greenhouse gases on the way to net zero. This inverse correlation between kind of transition risk and physical risk is really important because it means there's no easy path forward for investors or the economy. Either both society and investor portfolios are going to face a balance of these two types of risks and opportunities moving forward into the transition. And understanding these risks and opportunities and the interplay with physical risk is going to be key for investors and for the sector as a whole to prosper in the coming years and decades. And this is why, of course, both of our organizations are working on tools for investors to understand and capitalize on these opportunities.
Chris, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I'll pick up with some examples. And I think that concept of risk and opportunity being a pairing is obviously key. I think some of our clients we're seeing perhaps starting on this journey from a risk perspective, perhaps because of regulatory requirements. But that underlying fundamental analysis that lies behind that is equally the same analysis, of course, that allows you to identify opportunity. I guess the most familiar one that a lot of people clearly are talking about is in power generation, with the risk of stranding for fossil-fired power generators, but clearly huge opportunity in terms of the levels of renewables, wind, solar, other zero carbon generation that is needed, as well as the increase of electrification and hence the need for capacity of networks also to be built out. But that same sort of process is going to be key in other sectors, other high carbon sectors. So perhaps a little bit further along the line from power generation, but let's take steel production, absolutely critical for the world economy, a high carbon emitter today. What are the technologies that can be used to decarbonize steel, be that carbon capture on blast furnaces, be that the use of green hydrogen as a feedstock for the pre-processing ahead of electric arc furnaces, and all of the investment required as that sector goes through a transition. And then a kind of at a smaller scale, if we look at buildings, so if I'm a bank with a big mortgage portfolio, I've got a risk associated with those properties due to the potential costs associated with transition, intervening to put in efficiency measures or changing heating systems. But on the flip side, that is an opportunity for lending. The costs or the opportunity in terms of the investment needed runs to potentially tens of thousands of dollars per property. Again, there's an opportunity from crafting green products and green loans to support that in the residential property sector. So a few examples of the opportunities that we're seeing.
I love those examples because they really touch on all the different types of customers of a bank or customers of an insurance company or different parts of the economy that an asset manager or asset owner might be investing into, and really kind of brings to light the fact that this isn't about sell gas, buy wind, but this is about help every part of the economy to drive that transition, accelerate that transition. I'd love to move from on from that to think about engagement and think about how firms in our industry can help clients and customers to accelerate transition through how they engage with those clients and customers. Love to get some thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I can jump in there, Colin. So absolutely, engagement will be fundamental on this journey. And really, from a bank's perspective, their business teams, the front office, relationship managers will have an absolutely critical role in helping their clients go through this the transition process. But to be able to do so, they will need to understand their clients' transition risks, the sector-specific barriers to transition, as well as the opportunities. So there has to be that education and upskilling of the front office teams that will need to happen, and it will be a critical enabler to the engagement process. And then it'll be about kind of really setting the right frameworks internally to then kind of send the right signals, if you like, to the front office teams, which will ultimately be reflected in pricing, because historically businesses haven't been run with carbon as a constraint, and ultimately what will need to happen is for the capital allocation frameworks to really build in carbon as a new constraint. So there will need to be that internal shift in frameworks to then create the right incentives to support the transition. And then again, going back to clients and how to then really make that engagement meaningful. We see a big opportunity for firms to create the right products and propositions. And Oliver touched upon that earlier. Ultimately, homes will need to be financed for them to improve their energy efficiency rating. The EV charging infrastructure will need financing. The whole power sector will require funding for them to then significantly move their business models to solar and wind. So there is opportunity to create the right products and propositions for customers to then create the right incentives to support the transition. The final element, I think, is to really then also think about how to green finance. So this is kind of the other side to the coin of financing green. And then this is about ultimately ensuring that as a bank, as an asset manager, as an insurer, you are able to get all your functions and businesses to work together, come together as an organization with the right governance frameworks, with the right operating model to support transition. So this bit is really about then embedding and operationalizing your targets, your net zero strategy into how you run the business, how you make day-to-day decisions. So all of those things, when they come together, then create the right platform to support your clients in the journey.
And I can add also what's happening more from an asset manager and asset owner perspective, and some of the tools that we have been developing. So in BlackRock specifically, we have Aladdin, that's our portfolio management tool, and we have been enhancing that tool and creating Aladdin Climate to really help asset managers, asset owners understanding how to manage on the sustainability front. So for instance, to understand how their portfolio level is connected with the net zero commitments that we just discussed, Aladdin Climate allows them to assess where they are going, and what they can do about that. So, for instance, to understand where the portfolio stands today, we are putting together and releasing implied temperature rise for the investments at the security level, but obviously then aggregated to the portfolio level that are derived from the current carbon emissions for, as I said, for the companies that belong to that portfolio. Obviously, next, to understand where the portfolio is going, we are projecting those emissions level. We are taking into a consideration to the different commitments that the firms are doing, and comparing that with what is required from a net zero or Paris alignment perspective. Finally, obviously, to make those insights and that understanding actionable, we are showing also how they can act on that state of affairs and on that portfolio to make sure that it is better aligned to what are the needs and what are the commitments that the asset managers, the asset owners are doing. And so we're empowering investors to really understand the impact of their decisions and their investments and the implications of taking climate action on their portfolios and on their investment strategies.
Thanks, Antonio. And it's fascinating when you think about the extent of the impact that financial services firms and investors can have on their clients and customers, but what's required to be able to do so. And Anindita, you were talking about the level of training across the front office. I know one global bank we've worked with, we've trained over 4,000 people in that front office to be able to engage with clients with that same organization. They're now engaging with their top 2,000 clients. Antonio, you talk about the Aladdin platform. That's a huge core system that enables the work of investment managers, risk managers across all these organizations to really have climate embedded in their day-to-day work. So this is things that really do change the operating model of our organizations to enable us to manage the risk, but more importantly, accelerate the transition and fund the right opportunities. Kind of stepping out of our own organizations, one of the critical things people often talk to me about is data and the challenges around data, and whether we have the data available to us to be able to make meaningful net zero commitments and to make meaningful decisions in terms of how we drive the allocation of capital to accelerate transition. It'd be great to talk about kind of what are these data challenges and how do we overcome them?
Yeah, maybe I can have a crack at that, Colin. So clearly data is key. And not surprisingly, given this is early days for a lot of this type of work and analysis, data, to put it kindly, is patchy today. We see that improving, and that will no doubt be a trend that continues. But it's fair to say that that is a challenge. What is important to say, though, it is a challenge that is not an obstacle to moving forward and making progress. There's enough data to do this, and that data will improve. So I think that there's no reason, that's not a reason not to act. If we start with emissions data, clearly, as Anindita described in our first video, understanding the financed emissions or your scope 3 emissions as a financial institution is clearly a core plank of this. And there's a huge spread in quality from relatively high quality disclosures from firms through to frankly nothing at all in many cases. So right now you have to work with that. You have to look for using proxies where that data isn't available. But importantly, also try and work out how you can engage to enhance the data that is available. And that might be through really motivate, through the engagement that we've talked about with clients, counterparties or companies that you're investing in, really set up the mechanisms by which you can encourage and directly incentivize that data to be provided. So, for example, maybe a proxy is set where data isn't available at a point on the distribution that's assumed to be poor. There's then a motivation, obviously, for providing data because that's likely to improve the measure for a particular firm, for example. There's also something about data access within organizations. I think in many cases, the challenge is not that the data doesn't exist, it's trying to get it into the right place. I think a good example of this, perhaps in the banking world, is mortgages. Clearly, there's a lot of information about properties that is assessed at the origination point of a mortgage. It's often very difficult to retrieve and find that information, which would be very helpful for evaluating transition risk a few years down the line. So there's something about understanding data within organizations and access to it. And then I think there's a move from the sort of empirical, objective, historic data, emissions or building properties, through to analyzing forward-looking plans and how that's done in a systematic way. So we talked already about the importance of understanding transition strategies, in understanding alignment and the future progress of firms, and doing that in a systematic, structured way that creates a way to look at the credibility of those plans and not just take a set of targets without understanding the commitments that lie behind those. Getting that right and structured is going to be really important as the measure of future plans and alignment becomes an important part of portfolio evaluation. And I don't know whether you want to build on that in terms of what we can offer.
You said it really, really well, but I'll add a few things. So I totally agree with you that the issue is not so much the data, as you said. The data is getting better by the day. The data is getting more accessible by the day. But I do think that one of the big challenges that we're hearing from clients time and time again is around the language and creating the common language to assess that data. Different providers that should give essentially data that should look similar does not look similar at all, or the methodologies or the assumptions are different. And so establishing a common language is something that we have been very focused on and working on. Obviously, you can manage what you can measure, and so establishing what is the right data, what are the if we want to talk, for instance, in terms of ESG, what are the exact ESG data metrics? How do you want to correlate? How do you want to compare different data sources? How do you aggregate that into a portfolio level? How can you go from emissions to temperature? So all these things are obviously things that the industry at large is thinking through, and that BlackRock is obviously doing its part too. In terms of BlackRock specifically, as I said, we're launching a lot in climate, but obviously providing a tool for clients around all these areas that we have been discussing is pretty daunting. So we have been building things internally, but we have been obviously through acquisitions and also through partnerships like the one with Baringa that has been very successful. We are building that understanding and allowing clients to act. And so trying to understand how do we go from these seemingly and paired set of data and set of information into something that is more comparable, that is more actionable, that provides more insights. And so I think we as an industry are getting better at all levels, not only the firms that are more focused on data gathering, but firms like ours also that are focused on how to interpret and how to act on that information.
Yeah, that's great. I think the a recent milestone for us in our work together on this modeling was completing the scenario analysis across 3 scenarios for a bank with over 12,000 counterparties, over 2.5 million residential mortgages, and many other assets besides. So we know when we can do things at that scale, at that specificity, down to individual asset level, that we really are able to drive meaningful conversations, meaningful dialogue, both with regulators as well as with our clients and customers themselves, to help them drive the changes we need them to drive. There was one thing, Oliver, that you touched on that I'd love you to bring to life a little bit more, which is around assessing the credibility of the transition plan of organizations. In a world when so many organizations are making net zero commitments, how do we know who to believe? How do we know who to fund and finance that transition versus those who are making kind of more empty commitments?
Yeah, it's a great question, and yeah, as you said, building on a point we made earlier around being able to do that in a structured way is going to become more important. I think what we can't do, is simply take a target that's been put out there by a firm on its own, because clearly there's a huge spread behind that in terms of rather empty targets all the way through to targets that are the result of a deliberate thinking and strategy and delivery plan. And so one of the things we've done with our clients is worked on assessing those in quite a forensic way. This is not just a quantitative thing. There's a lot of qualitative elements, but that can be done in a structured way. So, for example, is the target well defined? Can you actually translate it into a meaningful measure in terms of what it means in terms of emissions and what type of emissions? What are the demonstration of the commitments from a management level to deliver it? So are there, for example, incentive structures for the executive team around the delivery of those targets? And then there's something about the strategic delivery capability of the firm. Is there historic evidence of being able to deliver against those types of strategic goals? So yeah, that idea of a sort of balanced scorecard as a way to assess and then rate the target, which can then in turn, as Antonio was saying, translate into an actual metric in terms of a trajectory that's projected for that firm that can be used as you look at your portfolio analytics. That is something we've done at a kind of forensic level of detail with a small number of counterparties, and we're also working with clients who are really scaling that up to work with thousands of counterparties to do a similar exercise. That requires working out how to sort of develop some systems around that, how to create the right data channels and engagement processes at scale, but essentially trying to achieve the same thing, that structured view.
That's an amazing way to prove that our industry holds the key in many ways to this transition, that every bank who's lending money, every insurer who's insuring companies and individuals, every asset manager and every asset owner who's making decisions on who to invest in is able to look at that data, is able to assess the credibility of the transition plan of any company they might be lending to or investing in, and making decisions which then hold to account every company on the planet in terms of they have to have that transition plan. They have to be kind of in the top quartile within their sectors. Otherwise, capital is going to drift away from them to others within their sector, within their region. And I think that's just an amazing position for us to be in as an industry. It's a privileged position, but also a position of extraordinary responsibility. And I think that everything from what I've heard today, it's fantastic to hear that journey started, that the tools exist to enable financial services firms and investors globally to accelerate both our own transition to net zero, but much more importantly, the transition of all of our clients and the global economy to net zero. So we really do have an amazing role to play. That's it for our panel session today. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you'd like to know any more, then please do get in touch with us via #AchievingNetZero. And I'd like to finish by thanking you all for joining our webinar, and we hope you enjoy the rest of New York Climate Change Week. Many thanks.